There are many fantastic and wondrous creatures in the Pokémon world. And there's also Spinda. It's a valid question. Why make an entire video about this little guy? Spinda has never been useful in any competitive sense. Sure, it's sort of whimsical, teetering back and forth, but I wouldn't say that its design stands out among the rest. That is, until you consider its iconic gimmick. All Spinda have 4 randomly generated spots on their face and ears, and there are a lot of different combinations. So many that in Spinda's debut generation, the Pokédex states that no 2 Spinda are identical. And while that's not technically true, it might as well be, considering the number of different forms rivals the current human population of the Earth. But how did Game Freak achieve this level of variety for a single Pokémon on the Game Boy Advance? Like most everything else, it all comes back to the Pokémon personality value. The PID is a 32-bit binary number, more often displayed in hexadecimal, that determines many aspects of a Pokémon, such as its nature, gender, IVs, and factors into whether or not it will be shiny. To produce the spot pattern for Spinda, the game reads the PID in 4 8-bit chunks, with each chunk corresponding with 1 spot. Each spot has 256 possible orientations, and with 4 different spots, that comes out to a combined 4,294,967,296 different patterns. And if we count the shiny form of each, that of course doubles to 8,589,934,592. This insane level of diversity is the reason that I, nor anyone else, will ever have a true living Pokédex with all of the forms. And as a perfectionist, that one really hurts. But after I finished coping with this realization, questions started coming up that I couldn't find definitive answers to. Spinda has been picked apart in so many ways, but what about something as simple as which pattern shows up in the Pokédex? And how is that pattern chosen? What if 2 PIDs produce the same pattern visually? Does that mean that there aren't actually this many Spindas? How does this change between games? Between generations? Or the entire Pokéverse? Like any normal person, I became obsessed with this Pokémon, trying to uncover the most obscure, innocuous information about how the games treat Spinda generation to generation. So now, I think it's about time we dive in. But be warned, the Spinda rabbit hole goes deeper than you think. Our introduction to the little spot panda is here on Route 113 in the Hoenn region. Among the Slugma, Sandshrew, and Skarmory that call this volcanic ashland home, Spinda is the most abundant with an encounter rate of 64%, almost ensuring that every player encounters at least one on their way to Fall Arbor Town. If you happen to pay attention to the pattern you first encountered and compare it to the one in your Pokédex, you may notice something strange. The one in the Dex looks completely different, with 1 solitary spot on its forehead. Where did this pattern come from, and why does the game not just display the pattern you actually saw in its place? Well, in Ruby and Sapphire, the Pokédex will never register any other pattern so long as you've only seen but never caught a Spinda. If you do catch one, then it's that pattern that will be registered forever. To understand why the game behaves this way, we need to take a closer look at the pattern, specifically its associated PID. Normally, the PID is a hidden value only discernible if you have a bunch of other information, like the game's starting seed and the IVs of the Pokémon. But in this case, Spinda's pattern is a direct reflection of the PID, so we can reverse engineer it. Recreating this pattern in Spinda Painter reveals a PID of all zeros, meaning the game is probably not storing the original PID properly and defaults to 0 when creating the temporary Dex entry. The permanent entry works just fine though. That is, unless trading is involved. Because if you receive a Spinda in a trade before catching one yourself, not only will this pattern reappear, but it will become your permanent Pokédex entry. But again, all this wonkiness with the Pokédex is only in Ruby and Sapphire. In Fire Red, Leaf Green, and Emerald, the rules are consistent. The first Spinda seen is temporarily registered in the Dex, and the first Spinda obtained overwrites it. No more nonsense. What you see is literally what you get. And personally, I think it's great the devs were able to correct this issue so quickly between games. They found a reliable system for registering Spinda, which they will surely continue to use for all future games, avoiding any further Pokédex malfunctions. When you're dealing with pixelated sprites, there's only so much variation the game can display on that tiny grid, and this poses a problem for displaying 4 billion distinct patterns. First, let's take a look at the spot on Spinda's right ear. Of the 256 possible positions, 3 of them produce the same image, this naked ear. If we drop the 2 duplicates, that amounts to 254 distinct permutations. But it's when we factor in the other spots that you really see the impact. For every duplicate pattern in one quadrant, there are around 16 million possible combinations for the other 3 spots that include that duplicate. So in this case, we simply double the amount and knock off 33.5 million patterns from the total. But if you thought that was a lot, you aren't ready for the right cheek. Similar to the spot above it, this one can go off the sprite via multiple different coordinates. There are 21 orientations that result in the same image. Multiply the 20 duplicates with this, and you get 335 million more patterns that don't exist. None of the spots on Spinda's left side can phase off completely, so to filter out the rest of the dupes, we're going to go a little further. At a glance, you may notice that these spots are all different sizes, and plenty of them can intersect and overlap across the sprite. Take these 2 face spots, for example. Both are the same height, but the left spot is 1 pixel wider than the right, allowing the right spot to be in 2 different orientations while covered by the left. We can do this with the 2 bottom spots, the 2 spots on the left, and the 2 spots on the right. Now we just need to count up every time this happens and multiply the total by the other 2 quadrants. After meticulously checking each pattern, I came up with another 180 duplicate permutations, resulting in another 11 million patterns purged. With that, we now have our true number of patterns in Generation 3. At least for these games, but we'll come back to that. Before we move on to the GBA, there's a final anomaly on Spinda's chin worth pointing out. When the bottom left spot is all the way down and towards the center of the face, specifically coordinates F0 to F5, you can see the spot partially phasing off, often resulting in this hook shape. It appears that for just these positions, the game fails to mask the overlapping images, and you end up with what I like to call the Chinda glitch. The odds of you running into one of these is fairly low at 2%, so most people won't see one in a given playthrough. I didn't even know about this until I started researching Spinda, and I've played thousands of hours of Gen 3. While it's certainly a neat little bug, the glitch only affects Spinda in Gen 3, so no effect in future games. To me, these obscure and unpolished qualities make the GBA Pokémon games that much more special. But if you thought we were done with Gen 3, think again, because there are at least 2 more games for the GameCube we need to talk about, the first being Pokémon Box. This proto-bank doesn't offer much in terms of gameplay. All you can really do is store a bunch of Pokémon from other games and play Ruby and Sapphire on the TV. But there's also a little feature where you can assemble sprites on a stage and show off the Pokémon you've collected. And if you take a close look at the sprite for Spinda, you'll notice it doesn't match any Spinda you've deposited. It turns out that Pokémon Box has its own default pattern just for this feature, with the following PID. Why this pattern was chosen, we may never know. Another mystery pattern added to the list. Our last stop in Gen 3 is in the desert-ridden Ore region, the setting of Pokémon Colosseum and XD Gale of Darkness. Spinda is uncatchable in both, but can be transferred in from other games, revealing its first iteration in 3D. This model is much more versatile than a sprite, so one would think that all unique PIDs now yield unique patterns. But there are exceptions that cut the total down a bit. For the spot on Spinda's left ear, there are 7 positions where it falls completely off the model. Using the same math from earlier, we can multiply the odds of the other 3 quadrants with the 6 duplicates, knocking off 100 million from the total. Aside from that, though, this is the real number of patterns in both games. It seems like we're moving in the right direction, until you take a closer look at the icons. Zooming in on these 6 Spinda icons, 2 normal plus 2 shiny from the menus, and 1 regular plus 1 shiny from the PC, it's pretty clear that they're all depicting the same model with the same spot pattern. Even the shiny versions have identical spots, just with a palette swap. Notice anything odd about them? Let's see what happens when we try to recreate this pattern in Spinda Painter. We don't have a good view of the right ear, but presumably the spot is either off the model completely or toward the outer edge. Next, we just need to place this spot in the corner and the other 2... there it is. Under normal circumstances, it's impossible to have these 2 spots here in one pattern. Only one spot can reach either position. That leaves a couple possibilities. Either the devs misplaced the spot for the right ear, or they accidentally added an extra. And that can't be because Spindas with 5 spots don't exist. Except they do in this game. If this spot on the right ear is close enough to the edge of the model, instead of phasing off completely, it travels through a wormhole over to the opposite side. This essentially allows you to split one spot across both ears, producing an otherwise impossible 5-spot pattern. But here's the thing. None of these patterns come anywhere close to recreating the Spinda from the icon. So despite having the power of wormholes, this pattern remains impossible. At this point, it doesn't look like we'll get a satisfying explanation, but at least I can try to recreate the two separate patterns that would come together to make this one. And hey, look at that. Both share the same nature and gender. So that's pretty cool, I guess. Anyway, I think we've had enough of Generation 3. Let's move on up to the DS era. Spinda is not the easiest Pokémon to find in the Sinnoh region. Before you can even begin your search, you need to obtain the National Pokédex and unlock the Swarm mechanic. Swarms add additional Pokémon from other regions to certain routes on a daily basis, with 28 exclusive encounters. Once Spinda is swarming, head up to Route 227 on the post-game island to the north, where you'll find them teetering on the mountainside in the falling ash. In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, the process is a little bit more accessible but equally convoluted. First, you'll need to beat most of the game and gain access to the radio on your Pokégear. Then, only on Wednesdays, tuning into the Pokémon March channel will include Spinda in the encounter table for Sprout Tower, Burned Tower, and Bell Tower. There must be some connection between Spindas and towers, but I'm not that deep in the lore yet. Alternatively, you can simply find one in the Safari Zone by placing 14 Plains objects. Long story short, this is the easiest way to catch Spinda in Gen 4 in my opinion, but you'll have to go out of your way no matter which method you choose. Overall, the Pokédex has a simple approach to Spinda in Gen 4. Rather than storing placeholders, the dex will register the first Spinda pattern seen by the player, regardless of which one you catch. Another aspect worth noting is the newly added Gender Differences tab. There are quite a few Pokémon that have slight form differences based on gender, which can normally be viewed here. But if a Pokémon has different forms that are not gender-based, the game adds this tab anyway because it can't tell the difference. This doesn't do anything for Spinda because the first pattern that's registered will appear in both slots no matter the gender. A small error, but something I'm sure the developers will quickly fix in later installments. Naturally, a new generation means a new sprite for Spinda, so let's see how many patterns exist on the DS. When comparing Gen 3 to 4, the proportions are noticeably different, with the head and most of the spots shrinking relative to the body. Because of this, each spot now has much more room to travel off the sprite, resulting in far more duplicates. Just the top left spot alone has 56 different positions for the same blank pattern. If we take these and add similar dupes from the top right and the bottom left spot, that comes out to 122 duplicates. Run that through the equation and you get 2 billion patterns that don't exist. And to add the cherry on top, the spots on this sprite also overlap, but only the two on the face create more dupes. There are 40 cases of redundant patterns forming, meaning we can eliminate another 2 million from the total, which by comparison doesn't seem like a big deal. At the end of all that, we've knocked off nearly half of the theoretical 4 billion patterns. That is insane. Don't worry though, there's plenty more pattern shenanigans in these final 2 Gen 4 games. Pokémon Battle Revolution for the Wii is kind of the successor to Kahlo and XD, except it's even less focused on RPG elements and is mainly just a battle simulator. I think the primary draw of this game when it first came out was the opportunity to see your Gen 4 Pokémon in 3D with epic battle animations. And while new models were created for the new Pokémon, many of the old models from the GameCube were recycled. This is apparent if we take a look at the Spinda icons for PBR. Lo and behold, we can see the same impossible pattern from before. These are new images, so the developers must have used a similar process for icon creation, and just like in Kahlo and XD, the pattern depicted is impossible to produce with an actual Spinda. That being said, the spots from this game are handled differently despite using the same base model. For example, there's no longer a wormhole dividing spots across the ears. Now if a spot is far enough to the left or the right, that spot will be undetectable with no visual impact. There are 8 spots on the left ear and 9 spots on the right where this is the case. Something I noticed while checking these was the added sensitivity on the spot algorithm. I mean, look at these 2 patterns. They look the same, right? Nope, because if we get close, there's clearly a few pixels that are more red than tan here. All that to say, it was tricky to find all the actual duplicates, and I likely missed 1 or 2 unique patterns along the way. If you don't agree that a difference of a few pixels counts as a distinct pattern, I don't blame you. Anyway, with no other duplicates that I could find, We just need to take the 15 and multiply them with the other 3 to get 250 million removed from the total. This is pretty close to the number of patterns we got from the GameCube games, but the gap would have been much wider had the devs not increased the spot sensitivity. Our last game of Generation 4 is the WiiWare title Pokémon Ranch. Like Box before it, this game is meant to be a storage hub for your Pokémon outside of the main series, with little else to do other than deposit certain Pokémon for Haley and watch chibis run around. If you haven't guessed by now, yes, the chibi version of Spinda does show the spot pattern and has a completely different system from any other game. Also yes, it was not particularly fun staring at these tiny models that would often jump on each other or dance around, so I couldn't get a decent look at them. On this tiny model, most of the 4 billion patterns can be displayed aside from 10 spots on the right ear and 10 spots on the left. That takes us down to just under 4 billion. Pokémon Black and White are notorious for soft rebooting the series with an initial Pokédex filled with only new Pokémon. The sequel games changed course by dumping older Mons in, but Spinda remains a tricky encounter regardless of which you're playing. In Black and White, the only way to encounter Spinda is to befriend one in the Dream World, a defunct online service that was last operational in 2014, and subsequently encounter it in the Entralink Forest. Dream World encounters have their hidden ability, a brand new feature in Gen 5, and you can also catch them in the exclusive Dream Ball, which wasn't available anywhere else until Sword and Shield on the Switch. The only downside to these encounters is that they're shiny locked and also impossible to obtain by normal means nowadays. In the sequels, you can't encounter Spinda in the wild, but you can still obtain one through an in-game trade with Yancey or Curtis depending on your player's gender. Spinda is one of many trades you can do with them, and the only way to initiate these trades is to call them 30 to 50 times from different spots around the region. If you're insane enough to go through the whole process, you'll be rewarded with one Spinda. While it retains the NPC's OT and ID, the pattern is randomized, so you'll get a unique Spinda for your trouble. These trade Pokémon are also shiny locked unfortunately, making it impossible to hunt shiny Spinda outside of breeding in Unova. Spinda is clearly pretty sparse in Gen 5, so the only other thing left to cover is the Pokédex. For any Spinda seen or obtained in Black and White, the Dex only registers this form. Yep, just this one. The sequels, on the other hand, actually fix this and register the first Spinda seen, or in most cases obtained, as the pattern in the Dex. Like Gen 4, both Dexes have a Gender Forms tab for Spinda, which still only shows the same pattern for both options. The Gen 5 sprites are just animated versions of Gen 4, so the number of patterns is the same. There aren't any major spin-off games that Spinda can transfer to and from, so I guess that's it. Let's move on up. Before diving into the next generation, there's an important change that applies to all Pokémon, but especially Spinda. For Gen 5 and below, the PID was the most important part of a Pokémon, determining several attributes, but starting in Gen 6, Pokémon now have a PID and an encryption constant. The EC is another 32-bit value, essentially doubling that amount of information for each Pokémon and dividing the Pokémon's characteristics between the two. This is relevant for Spinda because the EC is now what controls the spot pattern, not the PID. Thankfully, when the Pokémon are migrated up from older games, the PID is copied to make the EC, so you don't have to worry about your Spinda's pattern changing between games. All of that to say, I will be referring to the EC when analyzing Spinda's pattern moving forward. Spinda makes a triumphant return in both Kalos and in the new Hoenn region of Gen 6. In X and Y, you'll find Spinda in the late game area of Route 21 close to Victory Road. The first Spinda that you lay eyes on will be the one that's registered in the Pokédex. But there's a small exception to that rule. Instead of finding one Pokémon at a time, occasionally you'll encounter 5 of mostly the same species at a lower level than usual. These hordes can only happen in select patches of grass, and Spinda just so happens to reside in one of them. What if the very first Spinda you encounter is in a horde of 5 other Spindas? It's actually pretty simple. Pokémon in hordes are generated from right to left, and the first Spinda generated, aka the farthest to the right, is registered every time. Not as complicated as you might think. In Hoenn, Spinda's back where it belongs on Route 113. The Pokédex in ORAS sets itself apart by including these default icons attached to every entry that don't change upon catching a Pokémon. To show you what I mean, let's take a look at what happens after seeing a Spinda for the first time and running away. If you open the Pokédex, you can see Spinda's page, but the pattern in this image is different, and I can't access the full entry. After catching one though, I look back and I can see the default image is still there, but I can also look and see the Spinda I just caught. So for these games, the first Spinda caught is what's registered. The pattern chosen for this image will be the same for everyone and happens to be the elusive all 8s. The perfect pattern in my opinion. Oraz also has hordes that function in the same way, and both games include a gender tab that still doesn't do anything for Spinda. Beginning in Gen 6, all main series games now use 3D models, and these ones in particular will be reused for several games to come. With that said, surely the number of theoretically possible Spinda patterns will be realized by this model, right? No, actually. There are still quite a few patterns that don't exist for the same primary reason as previous sprites and models. On Spinda's left ear, there are 15 places where the spot doesn't show up. On the right ear, there are 17 places. 14 plus 16 times all the other quadrants equals 500 million taken off. So this is the true number of patterns for the foreseeable future. Before our ascension to the Switch, our last stop on the 3DS is the Alola region of Gen 7. For both Sun, Moon, and the Ultra versions, Spinda can be found at 10 Carrot Hill in the mouth of an inactive volcano called the Farthest Hollow. Its encounter rate here is pretty low in both game versions, making it easy to miss. The Alolan Pokédex adopts a lot of elements from previous games. Like in Oraz, Alola has default icons for every Pokémon before you can see the actual models. The image for Spinda depicts a pattern with this EC, and will again be the same pattern for everyone. The first Pokémon seen creates a temporary entry, and the first caught overwrites it, a system we haven't seen since Gen 3. The Alola Dex not only includes a male and female entry for Spinda that actually works this time, but it also has a shiny version for each, amounting to 4 distinct entries for just Spinda. After testing different scenarios and combinations in the base and Ultra versions, I have to say these games finally achieve a functional Pokédex that can handle Spinda, the culmination of years of trial and error. I'll give you this one, Nintendo. We finally made it to the current Switch era of Pokémon, which has lasted for quite a few years already and will likely continue for several more to come. After the 3DS, Spinda did not receive much love from Game Freak. The first main series release for the Switch, Sword and Shield, notoriously cut a lot of old Pokémon, Spinda included. That of course wouldn't stop you from transferring Spindas from older games up to Pokémon Home. Sure, you can't do anything with them while they're there, but at least you can keep an eye on them. Depending on whether you're using the Switch or the mobile version, Home has a picture for Spinda depicting the pattern we saw in Alola's Pokédex. But for much of Home's life, this pattern was a lot more prevalent than it should have been. Until the 301 patch, all the models for Spinda had this exact pattern, hiding the true patterns from view. Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl was the first opportunity to actually use Spinda on the Switch, rather than just stare at a model. With these being faithful remakes, I'm sure you can guess how to find Spinda in Chibi Sinnoh. The swarm mechanic is the same, the location is the same, the encounters are all the same. As much as I dislike these games, I have to admit I do like the little guys that pop in and out during the swarms. The Pokédex is pretty normal, except for how it treats the temporary entry. If you see but don't catch a Spinda of any kind, you'll find this pattern sitting in the Dex. Not so faithful after all, huh, Ilka? Well, at least they recreated the Broken Gender Differences tab. Good job! Anyway, the form you actually catch will replace this temporary pattern, setting things right again. There haven't been a lot of glitches to cover since the early games, but BDSP does not hold back. To start, let's take a look at the new contest system. In most cases, you wouldn't notice anything unusual as your Pokémon bounces around on stage, but if you enter with a Spinda, take a close look at the pattern before and after the contest begins. You'll find that the Spinda dancing in front of you is not the same one that you entered with. And to add to the confusion, starting another contest will produce another pattern. This little mishap is not a glitch per se, but instead an inside look at how contests work in general. Instead of actually using your Pokemon's data, BDSP creates a new Pokemon with the same species, gender, form, and shininess every time you start a contest. The one piece of information that isn't accounted for and necessary for the Spinda pattern is of course the encryption constant. And while most games so far have defaulted to 0 or a specific pattern when information is missing, BDSP seems to select a temporary EC at random, using info stored in memory or some other method. There's another glitch in BDSP though that deserves our attention, and it goes far beyond some pattern mix-up in one side mechanic. What if I told you that this Spinda is a lie? And not just that one, but this one too, and this one, and this one, and this one, not this one, but this one, and this one, and this one too. Despite their pursuit of a faithful remake, Ilka made another big change to how Spinda patterns work in these two games. As we went over in the very beginning, Spinda spots are determined by reading the PID, now the equivalent EC, in 4 8-bit chunks. The game usually treats the EC as a little endian value, meaning the bytes are read from right to left. However, in BDSP, the EC is now read as a big endian value, or left to right. Let's see how this affects each pattern. If we read this EC as little endian, these bytes determine the left ear spot, these determine the right ear, these the left cheek, and these the right. Now let's read the same EC as a big endian value. These bytes for the left ear, left cheek, right cheek. As you can see, the read order matters, and because these games reversed it, nearly all Spinda patterns are incorrect. I say nearly all because there actually are several different ECs that can be read in any order to produce the same pattern, such as one with a repeating value, or pairs of values. To calculate the number of unaffected patterns, we need to take the possible orientations of one pair of bytes, or one spot, and multiply it by that of another spot. Either all the pairs must be the same, or 2 pairs must be mirrored by the other 2, so all the variety comes from just 4 digits. This comes out to only 65,536 patterns that are correct in BDSP. And because the game uses the same pattern system from Gen 6 on, that means the rest of these patterns are wrong. It took a while for people to notice this change, as the EC is usually a hidden value and home compatibility was not ready when BDSP launched. When they did eventually roll it out, Spinda was one of the few Pokemon that could not be transferred out of the remakes. It seems the pattern discrepancy was too much for the devs to handle, and as of the release of this video, Spinda remains trapped in Chibi Purgatory with all the other Spinda being forbidden to enter. And it's a real shame with this being the only Switch game that Spinda exists in as of Scarlet and Violet. Here's hoping Legends ZA finally frees Spinda from its prison. I've pretty much covered all of the main series games, but it is hard to talk about Pokemon without including one of their primary revenue streams, Pokémon Go. Spinda was first added to the game in the summer of 2018 with 8 different patterns. Each month, a select pattern will be available as a reward for completing the field research task, make 5 great curveball throws in a row. The following year, a 9th pattern with a heart shape was added for the Valentine's Day event and continues to reappear every February. In the summer of 2019, Shiny Spinda was added to the game, except instead of getting the shiny versions of the existing patterns, we got a whole new set of 9 different ones. 3 years later, Niantic removed the unique shinies and replaced them with the actual shiny versions of the original 9, with the exception of the heart pattern, which remained unique as it appears intentionally designed that way. Currently, these 9 patterns, plus the heart shiny, remain the only Spinda available, but it appears that Niantic intends to release at least 11 more due to the empty slots in the Pokédex. Most Pokemon caught on the app can be transferred to home where they then have access to the main series. Spinda unfortunately cannot be transferred, most likely because each pattern is static and not determined by an EC. Once again, Spinda is trapped in another pocket of the Pokeverse. Now, I wouldn't have brought up Go at all if it weren't for the brand new patterns introduced. The most obvious example is the Valentine's Heart pattern and the shiny variant, but many of the others also seem to mess with the original formula. In some of the patterns, one spot on the face is noticeably larger than the other, something that is not possible to replicate elsewhere. This applies to about half of them at first glance, but to be safe, I'll consider every Go pattern to be distinct among all the others, adding on to any theoretical total. Alright, we've covered all the main series games plus Go, and boy were there some bumps along the way. Now that you have an idea of all the challenges a Pokemon like Spinda can pose for all sorts of mechanics and formats, it's time to answer a complicated question. How many Spinda patterns are there? As we just saw, the answer depends on the game you're playing and your perspective. Let's review how each game stacks up. At the very bottom, we have Gen 4 DS games at 2,245,525,504 patterns, over 2 billion short of the theoretical total. Next, we have the modern system that started in Gen 6 with 3,791,650,816 patterns. Then we have the GBA games at 3,914,072,064, followed by Pokemon Ranch at 3,959,422,976. For the runner-up for most patterns in one game, there's Pokemon Battle Revolution at 4,043,309,056. And finally, the game or games with the most patterns in the entire franchise are Pokemon Colosseum and XD Gale of Darkness, at 4,194,304,000, just over 100 million shy of the total, although these games do kind of cheat with the spot wormhole. While there's no single game that contains every Spinda makes an appearance in some form across all of the games. So there really are this many, just not in one place and not since the modern iteration of Spinda on the 3DS. And if you want to be super technical, you can even add the Pokémon Go forms to this as well. And that's literally everything I can think to cover about Spinda in the Pokémon games. Although, there is one more thing. On this Spinda journey of mine, I scoured the internet looking for all the material and games that I could find, and I noticed something. No matter the media or the medium, I kept seeing a familiar face. This Spinda has no name or backstory to my knowledge. Its past is as mysterious as the Mystery Zone itself. Nevertheless, everywhere I looked, I saw its face. And it wasn't until the latter part of my quest that my suspicions were confirmed. The Pokémon Company dedicates a lot of resources to depicting their precious monsters in exactly the right way. With something like Spinda, they can't just randomly assign a pattern with every iteration. They need a consistent reference point. They need a definitive pattern. We've come across many patterns throughout that, whether intentionally or not, served the role of the default, but most of these are one-offs and aren't nearly as prevalent as this pattern right here. This, the pattern immortalized in Gen 7's Pokédex and Pokémon Home, is Nintendo's pick as representative for all other Spindas. As we deduced earlier, the EC for this pattern is the following. If we were looking at this Spinda in Gen 3 through 5, where the PID determines the pattern, that would make this a female with a lonely nature. And this pattern appears well within that period, so I'm going to go ahead and say that she's officially canon. This theorizing has been fun and all, but what if I actually wanted to catch the queen of all Spindas? And let's just say the goal is to obtain her from her home generation on the GBA. Well, as I'm sure you know by now, there are 4 billion different PIDs a Spinda can have, and we're hunting for just one of those, which comes out to a 0.000000002% chance. So if we assume that each encounter will take about 15 seconds, which is on the lower end, then to reach odds, I would need to hunt for about 2,042 years. Sounds pretty tempting. But before you dive in, there's something you should know about Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. While there may be 4 billion possible PIDs, you can't find 4 billion different Spindas in the wild due to how these encounters are generated and the limited encounter slots. And unfortunately, it just so happens that the Spinda Queen is one of those PIDs that will never appear in the wild. That leaves us with only one option. Breed. So it takes a little bit longer than 15 seconds to hatch an egg, and you can only hold 5 at a time. Let's just say that it takes 5 minutes per hatch. That would put us at 40... You know what? Call me crazy, but I don't think I'm going to do this. I guess it's a lost cause. Is what I would say if not for the power of RNG manipulation. We can use external tools on a computer to predict when the Spinda Queen will appear and follow those steps straight to our target. Even with this extra knowledge though, it's not going to be easy. I still have to find her and time my inputs with frame-perfect precision, sometimes back to back. Let's just start with how I found this Spinda to begin with. The first thing we need to do is choose which game we need to breed Spinda in. There's actually a major difference between Ruby Sapphire and Emerald when it comes to egg generation. Both games use a 2-step process in which an RNG call is made to generate an egg every 255 steps, and then more attributes of the egg are determined once it's received by the player. When an egg is generated in Ruby and Sapphire, the first half of the PID is assigned to it, followed by the second half and the IVs upon receiving it. In Emerald, however, the entire PID is generated with the egg and the IVs are determined once received. This may sound like a small difference, but it has massive implications for the hunt. To see why, let's dive deeper into the RNG mechanics. In the Gen 3 games, all randomness is produced by a pseudo-random number generation system. The PRNG works by taking an initial seed value, usually derived from the game or the system's timekeeping, and plugs it into an algorithm that spits out a new 16-bit value, and the process repeats continuously. The games run at 60 frames per second, and each frame has a corresponding 16-bit seed. The possible outcomes that will occur and the Pokémon that you can catch all hinge on the initial seed and its subsequent results, which can be difficult to control depending on the game. Luckily for us, the initial seed for the Hoenn games is the same every time. When Ruby and Sapphire have a dead battery, and most copies do at this point unless replaced, the initial seed defaults to 5A0. In Emerald, The game is bugged and always starts with an initial seed of 0 unless you're beginning a new game. Knowing the starting seed of each game allows us to accurately predict which Pokémon will be generated and under what circumstances. Now to apply this to the egg conundrum. Because each game's PRNG begins at the same point every time, the PID we're looking for is always going to be a set number of frames away, and if it's too far, it won't be viable to go for. In Emerald, where the PID is generated in one instance, there's only one possible PID for every frame, so in a 36,000 frame window, there are only 36,000 out of 4 billion chances to get the right PID. And spoiler alert, the Spinda Queen isn't anywhere close to that. Now compare that to Ruby and Sapphire's two-part system. Instead of only 36,000, there are potentially over 1 billion options in the same 10-minute window. Clearly, this is the way to go if I want the best chance at finding the right Spinda. So I began by looking for the first half of the PID in Pokefinder, and in no time, I found this one at 24,839 frames away from 5A0. Next, I needed to find the second half, and I couldn't. Even after broadening my search way longer after boot, there wasn't a single seed that produced the last 4 digits. However, hope is not lost. Just in the last few years, RNGers have discovered a revolutionary new method to modify the seed of the game, and it's all thanks to this painting. Well, not this one in particular. There are a few that will meet our needs. In short, when you click on a painting in the contest hall or in the museum, this little blur effect for whatever reason reseeds the game according to the current visual frame. For example, if I'm playing Sapphire, the game boots up starting at 5A0. When I click on the painting 2,000 frames after, that 2,000 gets converted into hex and becomes the new current seed, which opens up a whole new world of possibilities. With this strategy, I can now access PIDs in minutes that would otherwise take hours, days, or even weeks of leaving the game running. And because I have added flexibility, I've decided to be a little bit more picky about my Spinda. It's not going to be very difficult to find the second half at this point, so I decided to go for a spread with 31 IVs and all stats as well. That is significantly more rare, but with a little bit of haphazard button mashing and control F'ing, I found a seed that puts me 22,176 frames away from obtaining the ultimate Spinda. Okay, so at this point I know exactly how to feasibly get my target, and I could do this in any copy of RS or any save file. Of course, I think there's one more component here that I'm missing. Since I know which PID I'm going for, it would be relatively easy to start a new file with the right trainer ID and secret ID to make this Spinda shiny. So that's what I'm gonna do. All it takes is a quick search in Pokefinder, and I find which IDs I need and which frame to aim for. Roll that montage. Alright, so at a minimum, I just need to make it to Route 113, but I went ahead all the way to Lily Cove because the painting here is a little more convenient for future calibration. Taking a look at my target spread here, I can see that 3 of the stats, Defense, Special Attack, and Special Defense, will always be 31 while the remaining HP, Attack, and Speed are passed down from the parents. The first parent needs 31 IVs in HP and Attack, while the second only needs 31 in Speed. These are not difficult spreads to find in the wild, so I promptly used another RNG manip to find suitable parents. Spinda in particular is easy to do this with because you can tell exactly which one you landed on by checking the pattern. The only other thing that might come in handy is having some rare candies for when I have to calc the IVs, and I really don't want to take the time to farm them. So I traded some over from my copy of Emerald. With that, everything is now in place. I put the parents in the daycare and walked 254 steps. A max repel will wear off in 250, so I use one to help keep track. At this point, I save before making the final step to generate the egg, and I plug in my target into Flow Timer. For every attempt, I reset the game and the timer at the same time and take a step forward when the timer ends. An egg is not guaranteed to generate every time, so if there is no egg, I just try again. If there is one, I save in front of the daycare man to lock in those first 4 digits of the PID. Then, I go ahead and receive the egg, hatch it, and search for this Spinda. All I'm looking for is for the ear spots to be in this position, but I need to calc the IVs as well to know exactly where I ended up and how much time to add or subtract. Once I determine where I landed, I reset and start the whole process over. This stage isn't terrible. The timer lasts longer than I'd like, and it is frustrating when no egg is generated because I can't calibrate when there's nothing to check. Still, I eventually found the top half of the perfect Spinda. There are 2 parts to this phase. Press A on the painting to reseed the game, and receive the egg on the right frame. To be successful, I have to hit both frame perfectly in one run. To have a chance, I first need to dial in on hitting the right seed, and then I can calibrate the egg portion. So I took the seed I needed to hit, converted it from hex to decimal, and converted that into milliseconds for my timer. Then, I did several runs just aiming for the seed using wild Pokémon to verify which seed I landed on with Gen 3 Seed Assistant. Once I was consistently hitting the right seed, it was finally time to go for the whole thing. Reset, wait, click painting, run, fly, bike, wait, egg, hatch, check. Now, a double frame perfect RNG is hard enough as it is, but there's one more thing that can trip me up if I'm not careful. You see how these NPCs will move around occasionally? Well, every time this happens, the game makes an RNG call that advances the PRNG state by 1 frame relative to the visual frames. Basically, NPC movement can throw off my calibration and cause me to miss my target even if my timing was perfect otherwise. The only way to deal with this is to pause the game during the waiting periods as NPCs are frozen in this state. That still doesn't prevent all movement though, so this is just another luck element I have to deal with. I spent an entire day doing attempts, sometimes landing way off and sometimes getting agonizingly close, i.e., I hit the right seed but was off by 1 frame, or I hit the right frame but was off by 1 seed. Still, no dice. Then on day 2, hey! We did it! Look at her. She's beautiful. Wow. Huh. Sweet. That rocks. Yeah, that didn't take too long at all, really. Definitely could have been worse. Double frame perfect is not the easiest thing in the world. Let me go ahead and save. So yeah, this very well might be the first perfect Spinda or default Spinda, and even the first shiny default Spinda that has ever been in the Gen 3 games. Now, I can't say that with absolute certainty, but it's definitely possible, especially considering you have to use 2 different seeds just to make the PID here. So let's take a look at this beautiful, beautiful Spinda. And What's funny is, in Gen 3, you can't even see the pattern from the back sprite, so this shiny sprite that we're looking at is no different than any other shiny Spinda in Gen 3, so you can't actually tell when it's in out like that. Oh, right, and this is level 5, so not escape. So sending it out in battle is cool, doesn't really highlight the actual pattern. Let's go back. And yeah, if you really want to showcase this Spinda in all her glory, you just got to go back to the summary. But yeah. Who could beat that? And that's just about everything I can say and do with Spinda in the main series. Even in a simple game like Pokémon, there is always something new to discover if you look hard enough. Of course, whether it's really worth it is up to you. Because in the end, you might find out that none of this matters at all. I don't even really like Spinda.
Everybody was Spinda fighting. Those spots were fast as lightning. In fact, it was a little bit frightening, but they spun with expert timing. There were funky Spindamons from funky Spinda Town. They were swirling them up, they were swirling them down. It's an ancient Hoenn art, and everybody knew their part. From a feint into a flail, and a spinning from the tail. Everybody was Spinda fighting. Those spots were fast as lightning. In fact, it was a little bit frightening, but they spun with expert time.